attendance. I'm waiting for your green light then to begin.
We can start. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's ASTM ARSO webinar on petroleum products and lubricants. Thank you all for sharing, or rather for taking time to be here today. I am Maria Giveraj. I'm a manager for global cooperation and training at ASTM International, and I'm delighted to have you, in other words, to host you today. We have two great speakers. The first speaker will highlight the success of ASTM Standards Alliance program in West Africa to date, and also identify existing gaps in the test methods in member countries like ARSO, while ARSO speaker will discuss the development of African standards for fuels and the importance of testing standards in line with available testing equipment. The selection of the main topic for this webinar, petroleum products and lubricants, stems from your own responses to ARSO's survey early this year, where 4 other topics were selected, including additive manufacturing, textiles, robotics, automation and autonomous systems, and nanotechnology. The first 3 topics were successfully covered in April, June, and August of this year, while the last topic is scheduled for December. ARSO, as well as ASTM, will provide you further details about the last webinar that we will host in December. This is part of ASTM ARSO webinar series scheduled for this year, as I alluded before. Before I introduce you to the panelists, I would like to, on behalf of ASTM International, express our sincere gratitude to the Africa Organization for Standardization, ARSO, for teaming up with us today, as they have been doing in the previous webinars, as well as other collaboration areas that we work together. Our partnership with ARSO dates to 2015, when both our institutions signed an MOU, and it has indeed been a great pleasure working with ARSO, and we are very, very pleased with the tremendous progress we have made to date. Before I invite Mr. Okungu, who will give us the opening remarks, I would like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. The first one is that we'll have 2 panelists, as I alluded earlier. The second one is that each panelist will have 25 minutes to present. And the third housekeeping item is that you're all in listening mode only, and please refrain from using your cameras so as to avoid any bandwidth problems. I also would like to ask all the attendees to use the chat feature, as you see at the bottom of your screen, to communicate with us. And also note that there is interpretation available from English to French and vice versa. And in order to access the interpretation, you should select the button at the bottom of the screen where it's written interpretation. Without any further delay, I would like to invite Mr. Philip Okungu, ARSO's Documentation Information Manager, charged with the official information documentation communication and member stakeholder networks and outreach. Mr. Okungu has been with ARSO for a little over 21 years, and to date he has been working closely with the Office of the Secretary General, who unfortunately could not be with us today. Mr. Kungu has undertaken various professional courses in quality infrastructure, including WTO e-learning, QI courses, and some other courses offered by the PTB on quality infrastructure and sustainable development, and also represented ARSO in various regional, continental, and international standardization forum. In fact, Mr. Kungu is just fresh from coming from a WTO meeting, which I believe was a successful meeting. Mr. Kungu holds a master's degree in library and information science and a bachelor's degree in education, both from Kenyatta University in Nairobi, Kenya, and various professional qualifications in standardization and quality infrastructure. With that, I would like to turn things over to Mr. Kungu. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you very much for the introduction. As you have heard, Philip Okungu is my name. I work for the African Organization for Standardization in the Office of the Documentation and Information Manager, and stakeholders, networks, and membership collaborations. I work very closely with the Office of the Secretary General, and I've been here on that position for the last 21 years. It is my pleasure once more, on behalf of the Secretary General of ARSO, Dr. Hemogene Sengemana, to welcome you all to this webinar series that ARSO and ASTM has been carrying since 2021, and it has been out of the topics and the sectors that the stakeholders and the ASO members chose in terms of interest and priorities. I'm glad that today we are discussing on the topic of the petroleum and lubricants, and it's a coincidence that this is also one of our topics with respect to the ASO monthly webinar series that we have been having since 2020. On 27th October, we are going to have our monthly webinar on the automotive industry, productivity, and trade, in consideration of the strategic role of the automotive industry in the industrialization of Africa, as it has happened in Europe, USA, and the rest of the world, including the Asian region. So our webinar has rightly been taken by the member states. I think it is very timely, because the automotive industry, if you look at the African Agenda 2063, you look at UN Agenda, the SDGs 2030, and you look at various continental blueprints, including the Abuja and the Lagos Plan, and so many other blueprints that have been done by the AU on industrialization. The automotive industry has been one of the sectors that have been prioritized in Africa, and especially under the FCFT agreement, to be developed in Africa. If we look at the current decade for Africa in terms of industrialization by the UN, 2016 to 2025, you realize that automotive industry is highly prioritized, and it is one of the areas that is being given keen attention by the international community, the continental policy makers, and also at the national levels. So we want to thank ASTM for giving us this great opportunity to have a discussion on the role of the automotive industry in Africa, and basically focusing on the petroleum and the lubricants, because these are also very sensitive areas for the automotive industry and for the success of the effective automotive industry in Africa. I want to take this opportunity also to welcome our panelists that we have today. We want to thank them because out of their strict schedules and on very short notice, they have managed to come to share with us on this very important topic that we have for today. Finally, I would wish to thank so much our participants, the experts from the member countries, the stakeholders and the industries in general. We want to thank you because we had wanted to do this webinar, I think a week ago, but the logistics could not allow us. We postponed it to today. At the same time, we realized that everybody's schedule is so busy, but here we are, and we have large participants participating today. So we want to thank you so much, and we look forward to a very successful webinar for today. Thank you very much, Maria, for now. I'll give back the mic to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your introductory remarks, Mr. Kungu. I truly appreciate. I know you also have a busy schedule. So with that, I would like to introduce our first panelist. But before I do that, I want to confirm with Dan that the session is being recorded. Thank you. I got a response from Dan. Thank you very much, Dan. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our first panelist, Mr. Augustus Airedo, who is the technical lead at Verity Labs based in Ghana. Mr. Augustus Airedo is also an international consultant, ASTM international consultant, based in Tema, Ghana. I'm sure it's a good place to visit. So we look forward to pay him a visit at some point. Mr. Airedo is a chemist by profession, and his experience includes supervision of the entire design and construction of the Verity laboratory facility, where he provides expert advice to the laboratory testing team to enhance competencies in managing assigned projects to maximize performance. Mr. Airedo has held various teaching positions at the University of Ghana, and in 2003, he received an Outstanding Supervisory Award from TOR SQEC from Korea. In addition, Mr. Airedo was a member of the Ministerial Committee on Evacuation of NLG from Ghana gas processing plant. And also, he was part of the Ministry of Petroleum between 2013 and 2017. He is currently a member of the National Technical Committee on Petroleum Products at the Ghana Standards Authority. Mr. Airedo holds a master's in philosophy in analytical chemistry from Ghana University. Mr. Airedo, without any further delay, I would like you to take the floor, and then we'll share your presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Maria. And thank you, Philip Okungu, for, I hope I can be heard clearly. Maria?
Yes, you can be heard clearly.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you and good afternoon to you all. Also, thanks for having me to share what we've been doing so far under the Standards Alliance project, which is harmonizing of petroleum standards in West Africa. Can I have the first slide, please?
Then, do you have the slides ready? Okay, then it's sharing your slide.
Okay, so I'll be speaking on the Standard Alliance project, which main goal is to help increase the capacity of emerging economies to implement accepted international standards to improve the quality and safety of goods on a global scale. This role here is to, not to debate let's stay on the first slide. I'm just giving an intro. So the role of the Standard Alliance project is basically not to debate the ECOWAS Commission decision on fuel and vehicle standards harmonization, but rather to encourage the standards bodies and testing laboratories to use harmonized testing protocols that are up to date and fit for purpose in the ECOWAS region. Now, we all know with the emergence of the African Continental Free Trade, which has come into being, the timing couldn't be better for reducing non-tariff barriers caused by standards and regulations that are not harmonized. As ECOWAS works with its member states and other development partners to improve energy production, distribution and utilization within the regions, the harmonization of standards and conformity assessment procedures will help to reduce technical barriers to trade. And so, can I have the second slide, please? The main objectives of the Standard Alliance is currently ongoing. We are providing training in support of the works by the ECOWAS Commission on Fuel and Vehicle Emission Standards Harmonization. And we seek to identify relevant scientifically based best practice documents that will support consistent requirements and evaluation of products. We're also looking to provide reference documents to be cited in regulations. And so if I should come back to the first point, what we're basically seeking to do is that we are basically going to support the work that is going on by the ECOWAS Commission with a practical approach where we are going to identify with some stakeholders, which I will come to, so that they will be abreast with relevant documents that will support their technical meetings, that will support their lab procedures. And then we make reference to documents that will help them in terms of arbitration, in terms of, things that will not bring them into any legal issues and all that. They'll be ready to provide documents that will go a long way to help. And then by so doing, we'll be able to facilitate exchange of product by minimizing or eliminating barriers to trade. Currently, within the West Africa, we depend heavily on imports. And so you have one vessel coming all the way from Europe, and you have the same vessel distributing along the West African coast. And so Standard Alliance is looking to have a system where the testing laboratories, the technical committee members will harmonize all the procedures, will harmonize everything so that we'll all be on the same page. And that will go a long way to, minimize or eliminate barriers to technical trading and other things. Second slide, please. All right, so this project actually started some years back. In 2022, still with the same Standard Alliance, which is formed by the API, like ANSI, API, ASTM, had a work plan that is shown on the screen. So in 1st to 3rd of March, we had our inaugural meeting in Accra, and which was very successful. At this meeting, we were able to during our first meeting workshop back in March, we looked at the commonalities in testing across our countries and began to dig deeper into the technical aspects of the ASTM standards. The same year, 4th to 8th of July, we had our second meeting in Nigeria, where we had other non-focal point people, finding it so interesting that at the point we even had to increase our plans to accommodate more people. In December, the 4th to 7th, in Florida, to continue with the D2 technical committees so that this opportunity to especially the technical, those who serve in the technical meetings, to have a better understanding of how they can go about their objectives, to go about their mandates as technical members. And then in the same month of December, we'll have the opportunity to visit API and ANSI in Washington. Next slide, please. All right, and so we needed to select some countries with Africa, and it was based on the fact that which countries in West Africa depend heavily on imports. And so after a lot of deliberation, we settled on Ghana, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and Senegal. Now, out of each country, we needed to have focal point persons that would drive the objectives and agenda of the Alliance project. Now, we didn't want to have, too much of top management, so that we were more interested in the people who were serving in the technical committees, and then those who are driving the standard on the bench. So we decided to pick 2 from each country, 1 from a technical committee person, and then the other is preferably somebody who uses the ASTM standard protocols as, a daily routine kind of thing. In line with this, we settled on 2 people from each country, and then the first meeting, which happened in 1st to 3rd of March, took place. Next slide, please. So our meeting in Accra was hosted by the Ghana Standards Authority. And as you can see in the picture shown, the Director of External Relations, Mr. James Olszewski, represented ASTM and was there, had a keynote address. And our special guests were lucky to have Professor Alex Dodu, who is the head of the Ghana Standards Authority and currently the chair of the ARSO. And so after the inauguration, we had a group picture. And so the picture below, these are both the focal point people and staff from the Ghana Standards Authority. Next slide, please. Then we moved on to Nigeria, and was also hosted by the Standard Organization of Nigeria, SON. We had the meeting opened by the Deputy Director of SON, and after which they gave us the opportunity to visit their petroleum labs. And then we had, after the meetings, after the visits, we came back to have the main agenda of our meeting going. So as you can see down there, we have CMIFA sitting there, and we are having our discussions. Now, because it was practically, involving, we did more practical work, more discussions on the standards than, just presenting what we had already prepared. Next slide, please. All right, so what we did was that when we had selected the countries and then settled on the focal point persons, of course, and depending on the role they play in the various institutions, we sent out a template to the focal pointers to complete those points, those templates, and then send back to us. The whole idea was to identify gaps that exists in their testings. And so we just settled on just a few in terms of gasoline and gas oil. This gasoline and gas oil, because these are the major imports within the sub-region. And so as you can see on the table that I have shown, we have existing test method. We have that for Ghana, Senegal, Nigeria, and Ivory Coast. Now, what we did was that we quickly went through them. And then, for example, sulfur content. You realize that Ghana, Senegal, are using ASTM 5453, which is the UV fluorescent approach. Now, when you look at the quality of product that comes into the system of 50 ppm below, I'm lucky to have the opportunity to be testing most of the imports that come into the country. And so I have a first-hand information about the levels of all these. Some of the quality sulfur levels that come into the country are as low as 1 ppm, 2 ppm. And so it informs you about the sensitivity or the choice of the test method to adopt. So for sulfur content 5453, 54, and 4294, we had technical lab tests where we tested those two methods and realized that it is more reliable to use 5453 because of the detection limit. You are able to go below 1 as compared to the 4294. So these are some of the things we identified and then we shared with the participants or the focal pointers backed by lab work. Then when you take vapor pressure, ASTM D323, which is the rate vapor method, when you go back to ASTM, standard for automotive spark ignition, ASTM 4814, 323 is no more in terms of arbitration and contention. You cannot use that because of the challenges associated with it. And so we had a physical evidence or clarification of this and realized that 5191, which cuts across even ARSO methods, cuts across the ECOWAS method, is more reliable than that of the 323. Then we came to the aromatics. This is where we had a physical examination. We compared this one at the Verity Labs in Ghana. And then we realized that, look, in terms of having to go by about 4, 5, or 3 GCs to do aromatics, do benzene, and do olefins in a sample, ASTM D6839 will give you all these parameters just in a go. So yes, we compare some of the methods, and then we also advised along the line. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide? All right, so the same approach, though. No. Thank you, yeah. So the same approach was used for gas oil, where we sent out templates for them to fill out what is happening. If for currently, if those methods have changed, then yes. But as at when we received this, we made sure we just put what we had received in there. Now, when you take water and sediments, if you go back to the method 2709 and 1796, you realize that 2709 is more applicable to the diesel than that of the 179, even though they will all give you the results. But we are looking at in terms of arbitration, you are looking at in terms of where you need to, justify your results. Which method are you going to go with? This is where we're talking about identifying relevant documents, identifying relevant standards to back the lab work. Interestingly, was where we got to cetane number. We have other methods there. There's nothing that we have in Ghana that, because Ghana currently we don't have the cetane engine, NAMA engine in Ghana. And so this is where we are also advising that, and as per the theme of this webinar, setting the standards in line with available analytical tools. And so if you take 7668 and 8183 as stated by Senegal and Nigeria, in terms of arbitration, we are looking at 613. But here is a case 613 is also not available. So what do we do? So most of the imports, certificates that I receive for the past 10 years, I can count the number of certificates that comes in and is quoting cetane number. Almost about 99 all rely on the cetane index. 4737, where we are looking at the 4 variables, or you are looking at fewer variables if you want to do the 976. ASTM is accept whether it's 473 or 976. Then again, we identified that when it comes to aromatics, you have the option of using 5186 or 1319. However, 1319 is limited because of the final boiling point. 1319 is more applicable to gasolines and naphthas and the likes because of they have a lower final boiling point. And so we also demonstrated this in Nigeria, where we compared the results. And yes, it came to light that if you use the 5186, it is better, and 1319, even the method under the scope even states that. So this and many more are the kind of findings and the gaps that we identified, and then we train the focal point people in that line so that those who sit in the technical direction, technical committee meetings, will appreciate the methods that is being, proposed by top management or proposed by the lab people, so that they can always be on the same page. Next slide, please. All right, so like I've been saying, after we had identified the differences, the gaps that exist, we had practical demonstrations in Ghana. We were lucky to be hosted by the Ghana Standards Authority Lab. We visited their labs, and then we also visited Verity Labs Limited in Ghana. Then in Nigeria, like I've already said, we were in the Sun Petroleum Lab, and then we went to Apapa to have practical demonstrations in the OVH lab. I must say that in GSA and Verity Labs, as per the policy of the company, we're not allowed to take pictures, but we were blessed to have Sun and OVH allow us to take pictures. So you can see the next slide where we have pictures of the visits. This is where they visited. Thank you. This is when they visited Verity Labs in Tema, Ghana. On my left, we have the focal point people only. And then on the right, you have other VLS staff also joining. Next slide, please. In Nigeria, OVH lab, as you can see, the lady on the top right, corner, that is Sherry. Sherry is a focal point person for Nigeria, and she is a chemist as well. And so she is currently demonstrating the difference that exists between the CFR engine in terms of run analysis and the quick, what I call the quick fix kind of equipment in there. We spent a whole day there to appreciate the differences, the gaps that have been identified. And then when we went back into the room, we made a common decision. Next slide, please. This is an SGS lab in Apapa as well. We're not allowed to take any pictures, but we had practical demonstrations to buttress the need where we need to choose certain methods over the other. Next slide, please. Yes, so there were important standard relevant documents, market relevant documents that we need to cite in our day-to-day activity in terms of whether we are a technical committee member, whether we are a lab person, and all that. And so we were guided by the diesel fuel standard by ASTM D975. We also looked at the D4814 for petrol or the spark ignition engine fuel. Then within our Africa region, it was important when you look at the good work that has been done by the team of ARSO. There was no way we could leave ARSO out of this, no. So we also looked at the ARS 1362, 2021 and 1363. We looked at other documents like the ECOWAS limits. We also looked at the individual West African countries standards, and then all this form the basis of our conclusion. Yeah, next slide. And so we had a very good discussion, a very good identification, and then what we set out to do in terms of the objectives of the Standard Alliance projects, which is ongoing. The targets and the objectives are being met. We've been able to identify existing gaps in test methods in the member countries. We have also identified how to select the right methods, how to document, and how to have consistent approach to whether it's a lab work or it's a technical committee decisions and all that. And importantly, we have been able to do what we call minimizing barriers to trade. And so if the chemists in Lomé, Nigeria, Senegal, Ivory Coast, and other places will be on the same page so that there wouldn't be issues of demurrages, delays, and all that. And importantly, we've been able to form that network where we constantly and continually discuss, exchange ideas, and then we move on from there. Next slide. This has not been, the Standard Alliance projects basically is formed by the ASTM, ANSI, USAID, API. We appreciate the ongoing support from them. However, we are so grateful for Professor Dodu and his team at the Ghana Standards Authority. We are very happy with the team from SON, Cordinum, the Senegalese, OVH Energy, and the management and team of Verity Labs Limited. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wairedu, for your outstanding presentation. Now we'll open the floor for questions to Mr. Wairedu while the second speaker gets ready to come on. As I said on the chat box, feel free to raise your hand if you'd rather ask the question verbally. I'm not seeing any questions on the chat box. Maybe we can move on to the second speaker. Mr. Reiner, are you ready to come on?
Yes, I'm fine. Yes.
Okay.
Want me to check? Yeah.
You have power back?
Yeah. Yeah. No, we're having some challenges in South Africa at the moment with our load shedding, and yeah. So, but anyway, I'm in the clear now. So yeah, the stress is gone. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So the floor is all yours. Are you able to share your presentation? Well, then it's done for you.
Okay. Let's go. Let's go like that then. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, perhaps I just introduce myself first. My name's actually Stuart Rayner. I'm actually representing the TTTFP. That stands for Tripartite Transport and Transit Facilitation Program. They're funded by the European Union, and they're tasked with assisting transport matters, particularly in Southern Africa and East Africa. And so if we perhaps go to the
Mr. Reiner, it seems like we lost you for a moment.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Okay, we can hear you now. And my apologies, I didn't do justice to you. I was supposed to give a little bio, a short bio about yourself. So if you allow me to do that for just a minute, I would appreciate it.
Okay, go for it, Maria.
Thank you very much. I just didn't expect you to be ready immediately after Mr. Wairedu. Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Mr. Stuart Rai. who will present on the development of African standards for fuels and the importance of testing standards in line with available testing equipment. Mr. Rai is one of the experts of the ARSO Technical Committee 51 on automotive technology and engineering, who participated in the development of the content for ARS 113 63/2021 automotive fuels diesel requirements and test methods for representing the tripartite transport and transit facilitation program TTTPFP, which he mentioned. So just a little more on Mr. Stuart Rai. He has worked for Ford Motor Company in the environment and safety engineering, where he had that role until recently. So he recently retired, and he currently works as a motor industry fuel and emission technical expert, and he has been involved in such matters in both South Africa and regionally since his participation in the signing of the Dakar Declaration back in 2021. This led
2001.
to
Yeah, okay.
the phase out of leaded petrol in Africa and paved the way for the introduction of vehicle emission controls across Africa. He was NAAMSA's Fuel and Emission Working Group Chairman. And Mr. Stewart, I'll ask you during your presentation to elaborate a little bit on this acronym, NAAMSA, Fuel and Emission Working, which you were a chairman of the working group. During the introduction of the first phase of the South African Clean Fuels Program and the introduction of mandatory new vehicle emission controls in South Africa. So with that, Mr. Rai, this is the floor is all yours, and my apologies for not introducing you much sooner. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Maria. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. So perhaps let's move on to the first slide, and we'll just talk about the presentation sections. First, we'll talk about the development of the African regional standard for petrol and diesel. That's IRS 1362 and 1363. A bit about fuel testing in Africa, using South Africa as an example. Vehicle manufacturers, how they monitor actual fuel standards, and how do they determine what the fuel quality is in various markets, especially if there's no standard at all. Then just, slight deviation. Let's talk about vehicle emission standards in Africa and how they are enforced. And perhaps we'll talk a little bit about some of the key parameters in terms of non-CO2 emission vehicles, non-CO2 emission standards. Okay, thanks very much. We'll move on to the next slide. So the two IRS standards, 1362 and 1363, were developed by TC59, which is the Auto Technology and Engineering Group. Now, this is actually has turned out subsequently to be a bit controversial. Now, why wasn't it done by the fuels and lubricants people? But I believe it was actually a very good decision, in that it basically targeted what the future vehicle needs are in Africa in terms of fuel emissions, more fuel efficient vehicles, rather than looking what the current situation is and writing a standard around it, or perhaps even just writing a standard around what may be happening in the oil industry without any intervention. So, as I say, I was part of that the group handling these standards as an advisor So I wasn't a voting member. So this presentation is a view from a triple TFP standard rather than from an oil industry viewpoint. So countries and organizations supporting the development, including Egypt, Ghana, South Africa, Rwanda, who were the chair, they're representing the East African community in terms of fuel standards. And so triple TFP supplied technical support. That's me, yeah. So the representatives at this meeting were primarily from standards organizations. It wasn't a case as being suggested that the auto industry actually wrote these standards. That's not the case. It was actually quite a methodical process. And actually, I think it actually worked out very well. Now, the UN environment work in Africa, well, I think we're all familiar with that. Personally, I've been involved very much. Maria talked about the Dakar Declaration back 20 years ago, I think. But since then, the UN environment have been promoting clean fuels and vehicles across the African region. There's been numerous workshops. I mean, as you know, leaded petrol was successfully phased out in Africa many years ago. And then after that, the focus became on the sulfur and then also on vehicle emission standards. So that work, and particularly UN environment, were focusing on 50 ppm low sulfur fuels, both petrol and diesel. So the standards guys in the meeting were very strong in terms of ensuring alignment with international standards and UN regulations and recommendations. And this was pursued, but noting, of course, the UN environment's proposals around 50 ppm petrol and diesel, which also tied in to Euro 4 emission standards for new vehicles. Thanks. Let's move on to the next slide. So, as I mentioned, the intent of the standard was to promote and allow the use of the latest low emission, fuel efficient technology into Africa, into the future. But however, having said that, it wasn't completely follow international. Limited deviations for local market conditions were made. Examples would be the adoption of a lower diesel density to accommodate synthetic fuels industry, which is a major player in South Africa, but also it is active in Nigeria, I understand, and there are plans also in Mozambique as well. One of the biggest points of discussion, which actually turned out to be quite quite helpful in determining our direction, was the discussion of octane, because we were following by the Euro 4 50 ppm recommendations. There's a document from the motor industry called RE3, which is the recommendations from the motor industry at various emission levels, and that was obviously a very convenient entry point for at 50 ppm, gave a full standard. But the problem was with it was only calling for a 95 RON fuel. Now we could see that was an immediate problem in that many countries across Africa were at 91 RON, and particularly in West Africa, and indeed some markets in Europe were at 91. So the question was then asked, how can we go and specify a standard for Africa, which is even more severe than Europe? But when we dug deeper and we went into the European EN specifications, they indeed did allow the EN spec, the 91 RON. So that then, was really a key point. So we worked basically the two standards were based on the EN specifications at Euro 450 ppm level. Okay. In terms of biofuels, the EU documents, EN documents allowed for biodiesel at B5 and ethanol at E5 and E10 in line with Europe. There was no proposal to try and extend that to those few countries that on a seasonal basis go for E20. I think that was too far of a stretch. Now, in terms of the actual test methods, again, we're basically cutting and pasting the EN specifications now. The EN test methods are the primary reference with ARSO. However, the issue of the use of ASTM specifications and test methods was raised, and hence a clause was inserted in the 1362 specification to make to reference that equivalent ASTM specifications are allowed. Now, unfortunately, there was an error there because that same clause should have been included in 1363 for diesel. But when I checked the latest 1363 specification, it does seem to be omitted. Yeah. So in summary there, so the final standards were essentially overprints of EN 228 and 590 at stage 4 emission levels, 50 ppm. However, during the final phases, a future move to 10 ppm low sulfur in petrol and diesel was added, noting that some member states already had plans in place to move to 10 ppm in that type of time frame. And obviously we didn't want the ARSO specification to be actually a step backwards. But a date was selected of 2030. I think that's fairly nominal. I noticed South Africa has legislated 2027. I think Morocco has already moved to 10 ppm. So that was like a management decision. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, just on the subject of fuel testing facilities, I'm going to use the example in South Africa, and this is based on my experience. South Africa has two fairly comprehensive fuel specifications legislated. They're very similar to those in Europe in terms of parameters. The refineries can all test to those specifications. Well, they must do. They're legal requirements. But there are some private testing facilities as well, and government does have an SABS laboratory. So I'll have a question mark there whether SABS are currently actually active in terms of fuel testing. But outside of the refineries, and also looking, around Southern Africa, the testing done is primarily driven by the by industry, and so really the testing is primarily focused on diesel parameters, but from the motor industry side, I know when we're trying to get samples done from vehicle failures, you find testing is expensive, and sometimes even if you're looking for an independent result, it might even require the samples to be sent overseas. So in terms of, as I say, the fuel specifications are mandatory, and the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy does conduct some fuel filling station inspections and takes samples for analysis. However, due to cost reasons, there are very few parameters are actually tested for, and typically it might be something like flash point on diesel and maybe rendement on petrol. Very little. Okay, but we move on. So how does the motor vehicle industry monitor fuel quality in the market? So now there are different ways one can look at it, of course. I mean, some countries have mandatory fuel specifications. Well, surely that's a guide. I mean, nobody would break the law, would they? But that's actually unfortunately not always the case. So what the motor industry does worldwide when it looks at a particular country to determine whether they can release their new product into that market is that they get very comprehensive analyses done of fuel samples in the market. So and this is done by a private company. I won't sing out the name, but I think most of you are familiar with it. And those samples are usually taken in market and actually taken back to labs overseas. It's not, and a very detailed analysis is done. A lot more parameters than would be, for example, laid out even in the EN specifications. And that information is used by the powertrain engineers to determine acceptability of the new technology into those markets. Now, that fuel sampling is actually done usually, it's essentially vehicle manufacturers, importers buy access to that information. It's very expensive. I understand some years ago that even to do an analysis on a single sample was over $10,000 US. So obviously individual vehicle manufacturers and importers can't even consider doing the data themselves. So yeah, so it is done by an independent company, and vehicle manufacturers, sometimes as groups. The Japanese Vehicle Manufacturers Association would often buy entry for their members as but for some of the for people locally, it's actually, you know, prohibitive to buy that information. Thanks. To move on to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to you have a quick look now at how the whole situation is handled on vehicle emission measurements, and because I think there's a bit of a parallel there that you know, I think it is worth reflecting on. So we just move on. So vehicle emissions, we talk about this Euro 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, is actually the vehicle is actually tested in a laboratory. This one is actually from my old company at Ford. The vehicle is actually run on a rolling road dynamometer. It runs under a certain test cycle with a certain reference fuel, certain temperatures, etc., etc. There isn't any of these which do the full Euro 5 and 6 test as a type approval in Africa. There are some facilities in South Africa that do the partial test, and perhaps can do the Euro 2 and perhaps stretch to Euro 4, but certainly not doing the full test, including the low temperature measurement. So let's go to the next slide, which is just a diagrammatic of how it all works with a vehicle there. I think most of you will be very familiar with this. It's all covered under ECE Regulation 83. It's a document, I think it's about 500 pages long, because I mean, each aspect of this test, you know, has its own standard. And yes, as I say, it's just economically not feasible to have this type of facilities in all our countries in Africa. So, but is that actually a problem? Well, let's move on to the next slide. Well, it isn't. Vehicle but it isn't a problem, and an increasing number of countries are actually requiring new vehicles to meet these regulating emission standards. We're only at Euro 2 in South Africa, but Kenya is Euro 4, and I think other East African countries have now it's moved to Euro 4, and I believe West Africa also is moving to Euro 4. So does it mean that we need to build these test facilities, you know, to certify new vehicles coming in to these Euro 4 or whatever requirements? And basically, really, the answer is a big no. It's just not possible. It's not financially possible. So what actually has happened, and if you look at something like the Kenyan emission requirements, which is actually in part of the vehicle roadworthy test requirements, and there's a little clause covering new vehicles, and they simply specify there that the vehicle shall be type approved to EU emission stage X, that's Euro 4 in the case of Kenya, and that actually works. So the vehicle importer there will be required to produce a test report from an ISO approved test facility at point of entry, showing that the vehicle meets the appropriate Euro 4 emissions standard. Technically, I can see from a standards point of view, that might not seem to be particularly watertight, but in practice, it actually does work. And obviously, the the test report can be referred back to the original type approving organization to verify that it does actually cover the VIN numbers of the vehicles which are being imported. Okay, perhaps let's move on there. So just having a look at some of our in-market fuel quality challenges. Now, as I say, not many fuel parameters are actually tested, and often when I've visited some of the other countries in Africa and which don't necessarily have national specifications for fuels, I ask them, well, you know, what are your fuel standards? And they would often produce an importer's verification list of parameters, and usually that is very short, and it just, well, I'll just give a few examples here, you know, of why I don't think it's adequate. You know, let's just move on to the next slide. For many of you, you know what all this is about. This is a catalytic converter on a vehicle, and it's required at various levels to meet the emission standards, and it basically consists of a fine honeycomb mesh with precious metals which cause a catalytic reduction of noxious emissions to those which are less harmful. But if we have one of the big issues we have, and we see it right across Africa, and it's something which is not tested for, is this problem of manganese. And I just move to the next slide, and I'll show you what is up. So there's a picture of the catalytic converter, and that red stuff, you know, which is actually clogging. You can see where the front face is scratched there. You can see the honeycomb behind it, which is now basically, you know, completely clogged with this stuff. And this is a vehicle back pre-COVID in 2016, and so this, you know, this is one of the parameters which has not been monitored. And we've actually, it's not, I shouldn't point out any particular country, because I mean, in South Africa recently, we've had a spate of the same problem. It seems to be adulteration of fuel, or perhaps also manufacture or local distillation of fuel, and using this metal to boost the octane level. But let's go to the next slide. This is a slide I showed, you know, at an SADC regional meeting just before COVID times, and we could see there that although the East African spec actually prohibits manganese, we also were picking up quite large amounts of manganese in Kenyan and Ugandan petrol. For reference, you see there, you know, in Kenya, there's actually an amount of 82 milligrams per kilogram was actually measured. Well, even the manufacturer of that additive, you know, does not recommend anything more than 18. And so one can see the types of problems we're having in African markets, and the need there for more measurement and surveillance. As you move on to the next slide. So yeah, just wrapping up now. So the African regional fuel specifications, they might not have yet been adopted directly by any countries, but they are providing direction to many countries in Africa working towards cleaner fuels for more fuel efficient fleets. I've speaking to our own Department of Minerals, Energy Resources in South Africa. Certainly certainly they are mindful of it. Will they adopt it lock, stock and barrel? Probably not. And I've heard other comments, I think in East Africa, similarly. Yeah, so while testing facilities across Africa might not be able to test a full list of parameters of the ARSO specification, this should not be considered a barrier to the implementation of such specifications. So what I'm saying there is, in the same way as vehicles are accepted based on test reports done overseas, we shouldn't be adverse to allowing fuels to be similarly allowed, rather than just a very short list of basic parameters which is so often used. As mentioned, testing by industry to protect assets is in place. We're talking about there the diesel, of course the mining industry does put quite a lot of testing, particularly on diesel. The cost involved in getting more comprehensive testing done, is prohibitive, and that is allowing some major fuel quality lapses in many countries. Just a suggestion, a fuel quality surveillance standard may offer a means to address the fuel testing cost issues, perhaps a standard with limited proposals, which would be used alongside, in parallel to, a full specification as per the African Regional Standards specification. And as I mentioned, direct reference to EU vehicle emission levels, while technically not optimum, is being accepted by the motor industry for new vehicles entering African markets. Okay, and I think that is the last slide. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reina, for such an insightful presentation. I am not a technical person, but I learned a lot from the slides and the content of your material. So we do have a couple of questions that came through the chat. I'll actually allow a hand raise from Mike Brumley. Mike, please introduce yourself to everybody and ask your question. Thank you very much, Mike. Mike, can you hear me?
You're on mute.
Okay, sorry, I was waiting for the prompt to unmute. Hi, Maria. Thank you so much. It's good to see you. My name is Mike Bromley. I'm a Foreign Commercial Service Officer posted in Johannesburg right now with the U.S. mission. I'm also the Standards Attaché for Sub-Saharan Africa. I thought that was a great presentation. We've actually had some issues in a couple of different countries regarding fuel additives, and it conflicts slightly with the EU regulations, which are actually recommending lower manganese levels than what we have in the US in some cases. And I could see it becoming a potential trade barrier. Are there any better standards? Not better, sorry, but perhaps a better harmonization of standards that we could use? For example, I believe the chemical additive being referred to would be MMT. That does have some benefits at regulated levels based on fuel efficiency. But however, as fuel efficiency improves, the level of manganese should go down. and it doesn't become as necessary, and then you don't have the damage to the to the equipment as was shown on the screen. So I'm just curious if there's anything in place we can do to make sure that also the United States, I'm being a little selfish here, I apologize, but the United States being a major automotive producer doesn't run into some type of standard barrier when importing new vehicles. All right, thank you. Over.
Thank you, Mike, for that question. The question is addressed to any of the panelists. Mr. Wairedo, you want to tackle that, or Mr. Reiner?
Okay, perhaps I'll speak to it. Yes, the African Regional Standard effectively prohibits manganese. It's actually it's allowed up to 2 milligrams per liter, which is basically, a trace. That's in line with Europe. So, that's very encouraging. In South Africa, it's prohibitive in metal-free unleaded petrol, but it's an enforcement issue, and I think it's I don't like to use the term sort of backstreet refiners, so where there would be no refinery using manganese at those types of levels. It's some type of backstreet illegal operation. But the strange thing is how it keeps popping up, in so many different countries. And we've even seen it in Morocco, and they're moving to, Euro 6 level fuels, and suddenly, as I mentioned, the motor industry does these surveys, and suddenly we see, whoops, this massive dosage of manganese in certain areas. And if it wasn't for the motor industry surveillance, it might well not have been picked up, because, if the motorist, everyday motorist has these types of problems, that they would not realize what is actually causing the issue.
All right. Maria, maybe I can
Yes,
contribute
please.
here.
Go ahead.
I think that in some document that I have chanced on, as much as 80 milligram per liter manganese MMT is still being used. And I see this as a great challenge, because for as long as the refineries are not working, we'll continually depending on the imports that comes in. The trader is looking for his or her money. And so if he can, blend, and then add so much MMT to it, especially if the limit in some countries are about 80 milligrams, they are looking at money. And so they are not looking at the negative impact on the catalytic converters. I think it's an issue of enforcement by the various technical, the various standard organizations, the various countries, to really stem and say that, look, this is what we are going to do. 2 milligrams per liter, I think it's a good start, which finally we'll see it going down. But I'm wondering how soon, we can do as low as 2 milligrams as against the 18 milligrams, because like I said, a trader is looking at volumes and not quality. However, when it comes to some places where they have facilities which is up to, determine whatever level the manganese is in the imported products, then that is where they have a challenge. Then again, we are looking at, getting the right tools to back the standards. Yeah, so I think it's an issue of enforcement to get this done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Redu. While you still have the mic, would you please answer Darlington Aban's question? How are the other countries that are not involved with the Standards Alliance program be brought to par with other countries that are not part of the Standards Alliance?
I think that's a perfect question. Mr. Darlington, I think, like I said in my presentation, Standard Alliance project is an ongoing thing. And I know that next year there might be a visit in the other, probably in Senegal. I know that ASTM International with its alliance are looking to back, users of these protocols so that they have value for money. So I am sure, and that's that we are going to touch base with everywhere that ASTM, has its test methods being used. So yes, it is something that is on the drawing table. Yeah, starting from next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. The other question that came through the chat is why petrol and diesel standards developed by the Auto Technology and Engineering Group?
Let me try this one. I think that when you look at gasoline, and especially you are looking at the volatility, or when you're looking at the distillation of a typical gasoline, you have certain volumes at a certain temperature. And so when you look at most of the technical standard limits, you have initial boiling point, which is very important to the car engine. You have 10%, you have 50%, you have, and then final boiling point. Other volumes are not that important. And this is in connection with the OEM, the original engine manufacturers that work hand in hand with the technical people that also sets the limits. And so the limits are set in line with the performance of the engine. Okay, and so this is something that is in tandem with the engine for whether it's a diesel, the engine for the same way. When you take the gas oil or the diesel, we are also important. We are looking at the 360 degrees. What volume are we looking at? We have a limitation there. All these are KPIs that goes to ensure good performance of the various engine, be it gasoline or gas oil. So yes, it is important to have the engine manufacturers as well in there, to also throw their weight behind the standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gastes. I'll have you answer one more question, and then the last two questions will go to Mr. Reyna. The question for you, Mr. Redu, is how are we ensuring that our local refineries conform to the harmonized standards?
I know that the technical committees that are set in the various countries, especially in Ghana, is made up of stakeholders from different walks of life. And so you have a rep from the standards, rep from the refineries, you have reps from the importers of petroleum, you have reps from the retailers, and so you have reps from academia. So all these come together to form the technical committee. And so they are informed and they all come together to set the limits. And so this is one way where, the refineries can also come up to speed. However, I think the challenges with the refinery is more of a financial thing than, setting up the standard, because they are already members of the technical committees in the various countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Redu. Please stand by. I may not have any more questions for you, but I'd like you to stand by as we wrap up today's webinar. So the next two questions are for Mr. Reyna, and this one is from Priscilla Boateng. She said on the chat, not all countries are on the same page. So some are ahead and others are far behind. How can ARSO help in bringing all on board in order to make trade, in other words, in order to trade in these products effectively? No country complying to 50 ppm or lower level of sulfur is ready to receive high sulfur level products. Also, other countries with high level of sulfur ready to pay for the lower level of sulfur products? That's the question. Mr. Rayner?
Okay, it's quite a difficult question, but I think you mustn't underestimate the progress which has been made in Africa in terms of fuels. I mean, because everybody said that it was impossible that leaded petrol would be phased out in Africa. Well, it was. And then the next target was the sulfur level, and 50 ppm. I mean, it used to be the situation that vehicles out of South Africa traveling, would have problems in terms of the higher sulfur fuels. But nearly all the markets, and a very few exceptions, are now at 50 ppm diesel, and actually South Africa is actually lagging behind in that although we have 50 ppm and 10 ppm, 500 ppm is still allowed. It's very difficult to find it. So yeah, so I feel that actually there's significant progress is being made. And then in terms of the African regional specification, of course, we've got that aspirational 10 ppm at 2030. But I believe East African community is already working towards the 10 ppm. And South Africa legislated it for 2027. So yeah, I really don't think that the ARS specifications, are unachievable, particularly in the type of time frame we're talking about.
Thank you, Mr. Rayner. Just the last question from Fatima Ojo, and this is the last question for this webinar as we wrap up. In developing standards for fuels in Africa, is there going to be some form of classification of the various fuels according to the requirements of the vehicles in the region? That's a question for you, Mr. Rayner.
I'm not sure I understand that question, actually.
Okay.
Perhaps you could just repeat it again, if you don't mind.
Yes, no, not a problem at all. Fatima Ojo asks, in developing standards for fuels in Africa, is there going to be some form of classification of the various fuels according to the requirements of the vehicles in the region?
I don't think that would actually be necessary, because, I mean, as I mentioned, the 50 ppm sulfur petrol and diesel was based on the Euro 4 requirement for Europe, which is being pushed by UN Environment Programme for adoption right across Africa, and I think West Africa is also looking at it. So it's legislated in Kenya, the inland East African countries are actually also to moving to that level. The benefit of the 50 ppm is it also allows the operation, although maybe not optimally, of even Euro 5 and Euro 6 vehicles. So in terms of sort of cost benefit, the 50 ppm level is actually a very good marker, and so there won't be any need. There shouldn't be any need, fuel adulteration problems aside, for vehicles coming into those markets to be reverse engineered, for lower emission standards, or poorer quality fuels rather. Yeah. I'm not sure if I've answered that.
Well, I believe you did, but if Ms. Fatima Ojo has a follow-up question, feel free to send the question to either ARSO or to myself. I will put my email on the chat, and we can follow up with the speaker afterwards. I will allow one more, actually it's not a question, it's a clarification that Mr. Walid Jibril from Egypt would like to make, and he will do it verbally. Mr. Walid, the floor is all yours. Could you please unmute yourself? Mr. Jibril, are you still with us? So basically, Mr. Jibril wanted to clarify as a result of the presentation made today. He wanted to clarify on the content of gasoline in Egypt. I've allowed him to unmute himself, but he doesn't look like it's going to work. I'm going to try one more time.
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Walid, go ahead, please.
Yes, just I would like to clarify the results of the manganese content in gasoline in Egypt. I saw in the presentation, you mentioned there is a manganese content in gasoline 95. There is no manganese content in gasoline 95 in Egypt, and we never allow to add manganese or any kind of additives include manganese in our production. And these results, I think it's not accurate, because in our specification, we didn't allow for manganese content in any of our gasoline production. It's 90 or 95 or 80. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Walid. Mr. Reiner or Mr. Guerrero, you want to rebuttal or?
No. I think thank you for that assurance. But the only thing I would say is that just be careful, because unless you're actually monitoring the fuel in your market, you may find that fuel not from your refinery but from elsewhere is entering the market, with these high manganese levels, and that has happened, I say, in a number of countries across Africa. And yeah, the finger's not pointing to the established refineries.
But we already control or monitor all of the production of gasoline, and we monitor the production of gasoline in service station too. So this is what I would like to clarify, just all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Walid, for clarification. We have now come to an end of the question and answer session, and also the end of this webinar. Before I hand over to Mr. Okungu for the closing remarks, I would like to thank all the panelists and all the attendees for being here. And I hope you had, we had a fruitful webinar. I believe we did. So, I hope this webinar enlightened you on ASTM efforts in the harmonization of standards in ECOWAS region, as well as ARSO's development of African standards for fuel and the importance of testing standards in line with available testing equipment in the continent. And I'm glad that Mr. Reiner gave some examples of the testing facilities in South Africa, and also the challenges that are faced in Africa in terms of the in-market fuel quality challenges. With that, I would like to turn things over to Mr. Okungu for the closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much once more to our panelists who have been able to give us very fruitful and very informative presentations. We also want to thank the participants, our experts, for staying this long. I've seen the number of the participants really grew. Almost we are touching 100, and that's very encouraging. As we highlighted and as per the presentations, you realize that the automotive industry is one of the sectors that the world over is facilitating industrialization. And for Africa, given our population and the increased mobility, it is a sector that really deserves keen and much attention. I like the issues, the questions that I've seen on the chart. I've already also gave my thought, and especially on the need of implementation and adoption of harmonized standards, both international and continental. And in this, we really are working with ASTM through adopting the ASTM standards as African standards where they are relevant, and also in the automotive industry. And I think that is the way to go, so that we can enhance greater cooperation and trade among the African countries in the automotive industry, taking care of this clean mobility issue that is arising due to the need for sustainability, or the sustainable standards that are also coming in. With us, I think we have come to the end of this very informative webinar, and we are looking forward to the next webinar that we'll also be doing together with the ASTM International. As usual, we really want to take this opportunity to thank ASTM for the facilitations and the logistics, but mostly and very specifically and specially Ms. Maria Giverej for the facilitations and the support and the logistics. If it was not for her efforts, I'm sorry we not really go this far, but due to her consistency, person also, and the need for this cooperation always to have the outcomes that it was meant to be. Ms. Maria has really been very consistent, and her efforts have always led to these successful webinars. Once more, on behalf of the Secretary General, we want to express our appreciation and gratitude to STM and Ms. Maria Giverej for our experts and the members. I also want to bring to your attention the scheduled ARSO webinar on 27th, that is on Thursday. And you will realize that most of the issues that has been discussed here will also be discussed and highlighted during the webinar, because it's about the automotive industry, productivity and trade, and touching on this clean mobility when it comes to fuels, the lubricants, and the emissions that are associated with the automotive industry in Africa. Once more, thank you very much, and we look forward to your participation also in the ARSO webinar on Thursday. Thank you so much. That is at 2:30 p.m. Nairobi time. Thank you very much. And also thank you to all my ARSO colleagues, Mr. Dan, who also made this to be possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Kungu, for your kind words. And I truly appreciate that. This is a team effort. And with that, I'm going to ask Mr. Dan Kitomi to take a group photo. So I'll ask everybody to turn their cameras on if you'd like to be on the group photo. Dan, you ready?
I'm ready now. I'm just waiting for people to put on their cameras.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much.
I'll take the first one now as I wait for the rest. You can give it a few more seconds. I think I'll take one and the second one now. Thank you very much, and we can close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. So the meeting is closed. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.